Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
I would like to start today by drawing upon where I had ended in the previous lecture, and the ending was about the new theoretical paradigm called functionalism in the philosophy of mind regarding the traditional mind-body problem. The transition to that new paradigm was made possible by what is known as token identity theory, about which we had detailed discussion in the last lecture. And I should connect functionalism not just to token identity theory, but also to behaviorism. In a way, I did that in the previous lecture, but I should recapitulate a few points, especially with regard to behaviorism. I did say in the last lecture that there is something quite significant that functionalism as a theory of mind draws from behaviorism, even though it advances in a significant way beyond the rather limited theoretical scope of behaviorism. Now, what is that significant point that I would like to repeat and reiterate in today's lecture? It is this. As I said last time, that the explanatory framework of behaviorism is nothing more than the stimulus-response framework. That is to say, there is environmental stimulus, and then that is correlated with some behavioral response. And that looks very much like the conditioned response, stimulus-response theory of Pavlov. Looks very much like a theory that's applicable only to Pavlov's dog. Human beings, of course, are far more sophisticated creatures. Therefore, the behavioral manifestation of a dog in relation to a given stimulus and the behavioral manifestation of a human person in relation to maybe a similar stimulus there would be a great difference. And the reason why there was an advancement beyond behaviorism, in fact, a rejection of behaviorism, a discrediting of behaviorism, is because mental states couldn't find a place, a legitimate place in a behaviorist theory. It was so very reductive that mentality, talk about mentality, was reduced entirely to talk about behavioral manifestation. This is intuitively implausible. It is counterintuitive, because after all, if you are proposing a theory of mind, how can you theorize on the mind if your theory amounts to discarding mental states altogether, or finding no legitimate place for mental states in an explanatory framework? In other words, given a certain stimulus, environmental stimulus, if a person behaves in a certain way, if there is a behavioral response to that given stimulus, between the stimulus and the response, there is a story, mediating story, very significant mediating story. If you don't tell that story, that mediating story, your theory is entirely impoverished. And that story has been, in a way, restored or brought to light by what is known as cognitivism in psychology and cognitive psychology. That is to say, there is a particular mental space where various cognitive processes occur. And that mental space with various cognitive processes is the space in which we locate all these states or events or dispositions that are found in folk psychology, namely beliefs, desires, intentions, emotions, bodily sensations, perceptions, as various states and processes, genuine cognitive states and processes. And those are the states and processes that are immediately causally responsible for the eliciting of specific behavioral responses. This is a fact that was completely undermined, or rather overlooked, or rather methodologically eliminated by behaviorism. It has been restored by cognitivism, and now to connect it to functionalism, this theory called functionalism makes full use of that restoration of what I call mediating story, that cognitive space, the space of cognitive architecture. That is to say, between environmental stimulus and behavioral response, there are these inner states, which commonsensically also is a description of mental states described as inner states. And this idea of an inner state playing a causal role in the eliciting of behavior in response to certain environmental stimuli, that idea is central to cognitivism, it is central to functionalism. Now, what functionalism does is that it identifies those inner states in a very specific way. And that specific way is already there in the very title, in the very name, functionalism. In other words, these inner states, which were earlier identified in terms of what they are made of, in terms of their constitution, namely in physicalism, they are made of brain states, and in Cartesian dualism, they are made of non-physical, non-spatial, some kind of spiritual substance. That mode of identification, that is to say, identifying the state in terms of what it is made of, what is its constitution, that is rejected. In that place, the identification is done in terms of what those mental states do, not what those mental states are made of, but what those states do in terms of their function, in terms of the specific functional roles that those inner states play in relation to behavioral responses. That's why they are called functional states. That means mental states are identified as functional states. They're not identified as either physical states or as non-physical states, but functional states. And these functional mental states mediate between stimulus inputs and behavioral outputs. Now, one could say, what kind of a thing a mind is? One could say, one could characterize the mind kind now as a functional kind. It is neither a physical kind nor a non-physical, immaterial kind, but a functional kind. And in fact, in calling it a functional kind, in characterizing the mind as a functional kind, one should also realize that it's not being characterized as a natural kind. I mean, the concept of a natural kind is very central to philosophy. I mean, in your ontological understanding of reality, what reality consists of, you will be required to distinguish what are the natural kinds and what are not natural kinds. For example, a tree is a natural kind, water is a natural kind. But if you create something, say a painting, which is a representation of water and tree in a landscape, that is not a natural kind. That's an artificial kind, because the painting is an artifact. So that's very roughly how we understand what a natural kind is. Now, if something is a functional kind, then the identity of that something is entirely dependent on what it does, what function it performs. For example, you have a mousetrap or a carburetor in a car engine. Both these items, the mousetrap or the carburetor, they are functional kinds because their identity consists in what they do, what function they perform. It is entirely defined by its functional role. So it's appropriately recognized as or identified as a functional kind. So mind is more like mousetrap in that sense. It is identified by what it does. Now that, of course, I think I had talked about it in the last lecture, this point that mind is a functional kind, that mental states are functional states, is a really significant, radical paradigm shift in the history of theories of mind. Indeed, it is a big paradigm shift from Cartesian dualism, and after several centuries, what appeared as physicalism, from physicalism, especially identity theory. Because now, in a way, I should connect it historically to ancient Greek philosophy, to Aristotle, because Aristotle had a very, very functionalist account of mind. So many critiques, many theorists would say that modern functionalism has an Aristotelian provenance, and that may be very true. So in a way, if that's true, then even if it appears to be a radical paradigm shift, probably that statement would not be, very strictly speaking, not quite true, because it has an Aristotelian provenance. But of course, the kind of sophistication that modern functionalist theory of mind has in relation to Aristotelian functionalism, that sophistication makes a big difference. I did say in my last lecture how mental states described as functional states are to be understood in relation to environmental stimulus on the one hand and behavioral response on the other hand. This is a three-term relation, that is to say, stimulus on one extreme, response on the other extreme, and between the two, in the middle, in the intermediate region, there is this mental space, the space of cognitive architecture where all the cognition goes on, that space of inner states. And these three terms, or these three sectors, these three dimensions are interrelated, and the functional specification of mental states, which are inner states between stimulus and response, is a specification that is importantly relational in nature. Not just that these three dimensions are interrelated, that of course is the case, but the more important point is that these inner states, the states which figure in that intermediate space, those have their identity, their functional identity, in a completely relational sense. That means mental states which are functional states are relational states. They are essentially relational states. Now, what would that mean? Let's take the example of a cognitive state, a mental state like a belief. Let's take the same example that was discussed in the previous lecture, which is my belief that it's going to rain now. Now, if this is a mental state, a belief state is a mental state, what makes it a mental state? What makes a belief a mental state? And if it's being a mental state is a matter of its playing a certain functional role, then how do you describe its functional role? Obviously, you will have to describe its functional role in relational terms, exactly the way you would describe the functional role of a mousetrap or a carburetor or a clock, in relational terms, in relation to certain inputs and in relation to certain internal states, connection with other internal states, and finally in relation to whatever the output of that functional system is. The same is the case with mental states. In other words, my mental or inner state of believing that it's going to rain is that state precisely because it is causally connected on the one hand to some environmental input. And in this case, the environmental input could be something like my perceiving through the window that the clouds are becoming very dark, which is a very reliable indicator of imminent rain. So that perceptual input, perceptual stimulus gives rise to this inner state called my believing that it's going to rain. And then this belief state, inner state, has its causal relation on the other hand with some behavioral manifestation that I make. For example, the way I act in response to my having that belief state that it's going to rain. For instance, I go out by taking an umbrella. Now, my going out by taking an umbrella and walking in the rain is a behavioral response which has a causal connection with this belief, the belief that it's going to rain. So you have seen that the belief as a state, as a mental state, has been relationally described. The belief is not a mental state on its own. There's no non-relational specification of the belief as a specific or particular mental state. You must connect it, relate it to these two sides, the stimulus side and the response side. Now, that's not the end of the relational story, because I may perceive that, I may have the perceptual stimulus that the sky is becoming dark, and form this belief that it's going to rain very soon. And then I respond to that belief. In response to having that belief, along with that perceptual stimulus, I may still go out without an umbrella. In that case, that behavioral response to the same belief and the same stimulus, same inner state and the same stimulus, could be quite different. In one case, given the same stimulus and the same belief, my behavior is that of taking an umbrella while walking out in the rain. But in the second case, everything remains the same, but my behavioral response is different. I don't take an umbrella. Instead, I walk in the rain just to get wet. How does one explain this difference? Because the stimulus is the same, the inner state, that is the belief state, is the same, but behavioral manifestations are quite different. Well, that explanation or accounting for that difference in behavioral response will require me to look into how that inner state, the belief state, is interacting with other inner states within the same cognitive space. In other words, that inner state, belief state, not only has its relation to outer relation to the outer environment from which perceptual stimuli come, and its relation to behavioral output, the inner state of belief also has significant relations to other inner states in that cognitive space, in that inner domain. And what are these other inner states with which this belief state could be related, and related in such a way that depending upon the nature of that relation, this difference in behavioral outcome can be explained? Well, that can be explained this way. Now, what other inner states could there possibly be with which this belief state is related? One definitely would be the state of desire. Okay. That is to say, when I have this belief that it's going to rain, if I have the desire not to get wet while walking in the rain, then this belief that it's going to rain and my desire that I don't want to get wet together will work in their relationship, will determine my behavior. If I have that desire not to get wet, my behavior would be that of taking an umbrella out while walking in the rain. But suppose I have the contrary desire. Instead of the desire not to get wet, if I desire to get drenched in rain because it is summertime and it hasn't rained for months and months, I'm dying for rain, then this same belief in combination with this contrary desire will of course causally elicit in me a very different behavior, which is going out in the rain without an umbrella and getting drenched. So you can see an inner state like belief is playing a functional role, a specific causal functional role in eliciting a specific behavior, a particular behavior, depending upon how it is related to other subsidiary inner states like desire. Now, desire is not the only inner state, other inner state with which a belief is connected in determining a behavior. There could be still other states. For example, I could have other related beliefs, like the belief that there is an umbrella in the room where I am. Maybe even further belief that umbrellas have the quality, the property of protecting oneself from rain because rain can't pass through the umbrella cloth. That's another belief with which this given belief would be connected. And there may be a further relation of this belief with further mental states like memory, like I recall that in the past this is what I did in order not to get drenched. Like that. In other words, there is a mental field which is a field of a network of mental states. And each mental state is what it is, has whatever functional role it has because of its relation to other states. So that's the kind of relational characterization which is very, very central to a functionalist theorization of mental states. Now, this point is significant if we go back to the past theories, because the past theories, whether it is Cartesian dualism or identity physicalism, they theorized mental states. They identified mental states in non-relational terms. For example, in identity theory, a pain state is identified with C fiber firing, some neural state, some brain state. Okay? So the identity of the given mental state was given or specified in non-relational terms. Non-relational in the sense that something is a pain state in terms of what it is made of, in terms of a particular brain state. Whether that brain state has relation to any other states, to stimulus or any response, those are irrelevant. The same was the case with Descartes. Mental states are immaterial states on their own right, not because of their relation to anything else. So that is quite a significant theoretical transformation. Okay, now functionalist theory of mind or mental states, even though it is a paradigm shift from earlier theories such as identity physicalism, there is one thing that is probably common between these two paradigms. And what is common is that functionalism is also ultimately a form of physicalism. But it is not physicalism of the identity variety. It is nonetheless physicalism of another kind. And what is this point about functionalist variety of physicalism? The point is this. And here we need to go back to that objection that functionalist theorists, philosophers made against type identity theory, type identity physicalism, which is species chauvinism, about which I discussed, which was discussed in the last lecture. That is to say that if you have a physicalist theory of the identity variety, type identity variety, then mentality is possible only for certain kind of biological organisms. Because to be a mental state is to be a neurophysiological state, and that was a strict identity. So it's only when the state is a neurophysiological state of a certain kind, it can be a mental state of a certain kind. And that is a restriction, species-specific restriction, that only biological species have the privilege, as it were, of having mental states. An attack on this calling this attack species chauvinism implies that mentality, if mental states are functional states, then at least in principle and maybe even in practice, many mental states should be possible for other functional systems which are not biological functional systems like human beings. It should be possible. Of course, it should be possible for very different creatures than human beings within this planet, but in principle it should be possible even for even more exotically different other creatures of other planets. And we talk about, almost proverbially, we talk about Martians. So why shouldn't we find it conceivable that Martians also have mental states? And Martians would be, of course, very different from the human species that are found on this planet, on the Earth. And such a liberalism about mental states was a consequence of the functionalist specification of mental states. In other words, if mental states are functional states, then there must be a certain kind of functional system in which that mental state is instantiated or realized. So the brain system in our case is a biological system in which various mental states, pains, beliefs, desires, sensations, all of these are instantiated or realized. They play a functional role in the overall organism. So now the question is, you can write the functionalist steps that will describe how, for example, a particular mental state like a belief state or a sensation state results in a certain kind of behavioral response. I mean, you can write all the functional steps about a belief state, and the writing of these functional steps would mean you would connect the belief state to some environmental or perceptual input. You would write this. You would begin the step from from environmental input or perceptual input, and then you would say that causally brought about the inner state called the belief state. So you will go on in a sequential way, writing the functionalist steps for every mental state. Okay. Now that means you are providing a functionalist description of every mental state in terms of these functionalist steps. And for every mental state, if you have all those steps specified, written out, then you can imagine whether those very same steps could also be true of an inner state of some other functional system, some functional system other than this human biological system. And of course, you could think about, let's say, a Martian brain, okay, as another non-human, non-biological functional system. And if the same steps could also be run or implemented in that system, the Martian brain system, then the kind of state about which all these functional specifications have been given, that state should also be instantiated in that functional system. Namely, if the functionalist description or functionalist steps are about the belief state, let's say my belief that it's going to rain, if the same steps can be implemented in the Martian brain, then the Martian individual should also have the same belief. Why not? Because on functionalist ground, there is no discrimination. It's like saying you have a knife which is made of steel, and a knife is identified in terms of its functional property, which is cutting power. Now, if you have a knife which is not made of steel but of plastic, and if it can also cut, then the functional description for a steel knife is equally applicable to the functional description of a plastic knife. Okay. That means mentality, the very idea of mentality, is the idea of something quite abstract. Abstract from its concrete base in which it is instantiated. That concrete base in the case of the knife could be a steel material or a plastic material, or maybe even some kind of other kind of material. But the functional property of its cutting, which makes it a knife, that is abstract. So mental states are also abstract in that sense, because it is abstracted from where that state, whether it is a belief state or a sensation state, where that state is instantiated. Okay. Right now, of course, we are talking about mental states like beliefs and desires and sensations being instantiated in in concrete carbon-based physicochemical substance called the brain, okay, or the central nervous system. But it's conceivable that there is another system, completely non-human, even non-biological, where the functional organization of the system is isomorphic to the functional organization of this human system, human biological system. In that case, if this human biological system can have functional mental states like beliefs and desires and sensations, so could the other system which is functionally isomorphic with this system. So this idea of functional isomorphism is crucial in making the theory pretty liberal with regard to the possibility of mentality, and that earlier orthodox view that mentality is the privilege of only certain kind of creatures, like the biological creatures that we ourselves are, that is considered to be part of that species chauvinism, the critique of species chauvinism. So this liberalism has led to another very important theoretical concept, which is known as multiple realizability. Multiple realizability is a concept that is central to functionalism. And the idea of multiple realizability is not necessarily a creation of functionalist theory, because this idea of multiple realizability was very much implicit in token identity theory, token identity physicalism. In token identity physicalism, the claim is that if for any token mental state there is some physical state or other with which it is identical, so that physical state with which a token mental state is identical need not be a fixed and definite kind of physical state. It need not be the case that the same token mental state occurring at different times in the case of the same person would have to be identified with exactly the same fixed, definite physical or brain state. It could be identical with slightly different brain state at different times. So it's token identity. And that itself means that the one token mental state can be multiply realized. That is to say, it could be identical with multiple types of physical states. Of course, in the case of token identity theory, the identity was confined to only brain states, but brain states of different kinds. Not like the type identity theory, where a specific type of mental state is in a fixed way identical with only a specific type of brain state. That fixity was relaxed, and therefore for one and the same token mental state you can conceive of, say, 10 different brain states with which it could be identified. So that already gives an indication of multiple realizability. And in the case of functionalism, that potential for multiple realizability indicated by token identity theory has been fully utilized, because the functionalist is saying that not only the human brain, which is a functional system that can instantiate or realize mental states, there could be non-human systems, even mechanical systems. All depends on whether a functional system isomorphic with this system in which mental states have been found to be instantiated or realized, whether that sort of isomorphism is satisfied by an alternative system. And that means one and the same mental state can be realized multiply, multiple realizability. Okay. So mentality, the having of mental states, is not a privilege of certain species. At this point, there is another transition, of course, within the functionalist framework, another theoretical transition of great significance, great historic significance. And the transition is from one kind of functionalism that I have been talking about so long, namely causal functionalism. What I have been talking about so far is characterized as causal functionalism, and it is so characterized because functional role is causal role. The mental state is a functional state because of its playing a particular causal role in relation to perceptual input or environmental input, and in relation to other mental states, and further in relation to behavioral output. And I also added, I had said that you can write the functionalist steps for each mental state. And if you did that, what would be the outcome? The outcome would be that for each mental state, you will have written a particular program. Okay. And when you have a sufficient amount of functionalist descriptions of mental states, I mean, when you will have written the functionalist steps for a sufficient number of mental states, you will have written out a particular mental program, which means you would be able to say that it is this mental program which has been implemented in this brain system. And all this sounds now, I think, already very familiar, because the moment I talked about writing a program, and that familiarity is with computationalism. In other words, this causal functional theory of mental states is pointing towards a computational theory of the mind in the very functionalist spirit. So the name computer functionalism has also occurred in recent theory as a variant of functionalism. And talk about multiple realizability regarding functionalism. That is extremely relevant to computer functionalism, because computationalism itself as a concept is quite consistent with multiple realizability. That is to say, take any computing instance, say calculation. Calculation is a kind of computing. Now you have calculators. You have calculators of different make, different hardware. But what is common to, let's say, 5 different calculators of 5 different hardware is that they perform the same counting function. That means one and the same program of counting is implemented in these 5 different hardwares. Okay. So the program is the software which is implemented in a particular kind of hardware base. That's a very rough idea of computationalism. And since I talked about 5 different calculating machines performing the same calculating function, it already makes clear that it is that the program, computing function, that calculating program is multiply realizable. It is realizable in this particular calculator of this particular make, realizable in that particular calculator of that particular make, like that. So that's the interesting relational concept in computationalism, namely the relation between software and hardware, relation between program and where the program is implemented, namely in a particular hardware. And here it is significant to say, I should just draw something. Traditionally, the problem has been, in the philosophy of mind, the relation between, here I would like to explain this point with a little bit of diagrammatic attempt. So traditionally the problem in the philosophy of mind has been the mind-body relation. Okay. Right in the beginning I was talking about these hyphenation, the hyphen between mind and body. How are they related? And that's how the Cartesian dualism had started. Well, there was a big problem about explaining causal interaction between the mind and the body, precisely because in Cartesian dualism, the mind substance is considered to be immaterial, and the body, of course, is extended, spatially extended physical item. So how can there be any interconnection between the unextended mind and the extended body? In physicalism, that problem was resolved because the mind was reduced to the body or the brain. So causal interaction between the two is not a problem. I mean, there could be other problems, but apparently ontologically these are two homogeneous categories. In functionalism, what's happening? What would be the nature of the relationship between mind and body? Well, here computational functionalism has this wonderful explanatory framework. It would be something like this. You have program and below program you have hardware. That is to say, a certain program, a software, is implemented in a particular kind of hardware. That's the relation. And of course, these two concepts, software and hardware, are completely different. Now, draw some kind of correlation of this division between program and hardware or software and hardware. And on this side, one is mind, and right below mind you write body. Okay. That means the mind is related to the body in a certain way, and the program or software is related to hardware in computationalism in a certain way. How the mind is related to the body is our problem. Okay. We need an explanatory theory to explain this relation. Now, the relation between software and hardware is already intelligible to us in computational theory, from our knowledge of computational theory. And we know that hardware is a concrete concept because a hardware system is a concrete system which exists in physical space, itself physical. But the software or program is completely abstract. Okay? And yet this abstract whatever program is implemented or instantiated or realized in a concrete hardware. If we take that as a paradigm to explain the mind-body relation, how would that look like? And this is what I would like to begin in the next lecture. For the time being, I stop at this point. Thank you.